Does anyone else miss the lost art of games that aren't these 40+ hour excursions? Like, don't get me wrong, some of my favorite games of all time, such as Elden Ring and Persona 5, are these massive 80 to 100 hour adventures, and of course you have games like the modern outputs from Assassin's Creed also being massive successes, but you know, I kinda like the games that I can bang out in less than 10 hours, or hell, maybe even just a play session or two. You still get these games from time to time with things like the recent Resident Evil 2 remake, but if you really want to get those short but sweet experiences, you really gotta look towards the indies nowadays. I get it, with games still $60 and sometimes even $70 at this point, people really want to get their money's worth. It wasn't always like this though. Back in the PS3 and 360 era, there was a ton of titles that you could easily beat in an evening. Mirror's Edge, Dishonored, Left 4 Dead, and hey, speaking of one of Valve's best games, Portal, the game that has my vote for the best game anyone can beat in under an hour. And when I say anyone, I mean the average player, and not the cracked out speedrunners, since it seems like you can beat almost any game in under an hour with enough practice and technical know-how. I first played Portal on a trip over to a friend's house who owned the Orange Box collection for his 360. At the time, I couldn't believe that there were 3 huge games all included in one package. Half-Life 2, Team Fortress 2, and Portal? That's a ridiculous deal. It was actually Portal as the one that got my attention right away. I grew up playing a lot of platformers like Mario, Sonic, and Spyro, and puzzle games are something that I always enjoyed too, and the thought of being able to do that in a first-person perspective like some of the shooters I was playing at the time, signed me the fuck up. But the thing that really had me hooked was just how open the game was with your liberal use of the portal making mechanics. This thing was just so cool. You could see yourself on the other side of portals, it seemed like you could put the thing wherever you wanted, and you could make an infinite falling hole and still somehow survive from them. What's not to love? I played through this game with one of my buddies in the span of an afternoon, and I kept thinking to myself how short it was, but man, I was having a good time. Portal is a game, regardless of skill level, that I think anyone could probably beat in one sitting. I'd probably give it around 3 hours or so for first timers, but if you played the game before, you could easily beat this in under an hour. That being said though, I also have the opinion that Portal is one of the best games that you can sit down and beat in one sitting. But before I elaborate on that take a little bit though, we gotta talk about the development process for this one. So Portal's development had a lot more of an interesting origin than I initially thought. The roots of this game can actually be traced back to a freeware game by the name of Narbacular Drop. This was a game that I've never heard of until I did research for this video, but it serves as not only the inspiration for Portal, but basically the prototype. This game was a puzzle platformer where the player would create blue and orange portals in order to navigate the environment. This was developed by students of the DigiPen Institute of Technology, and at a career fair held at the university, a Valve developer saw the game and reached out to the team to showcase their game to some Valve executives. Being impressed with the concept and the technology behind the game, Gabe Newell offered the team positions at Valve in order to develop the game further. Of course, a number of things would change from Narbacular Drop, such as the setting, the story, and some of the mechanics such as being able to shoot portals through other portals. During the first year of development, the gameplay was by far the primary focus, with any semblance of the story taking a back seat. While during the testing phase, there was a lot of positive feedback on the moment-to-moment gameplay, but the lack of narrative direction was puzzling. No pun intended. This led the team behind Portal to start incorporating an AI that would slowly lead players through the test chambers and put a bit more of an emphasis on the dry humor that they could use throughout these challenges. This is where the idea of GLaDOS really came into play, and she would more or less be the entire focal point of the story moving forward, with her character arc reflecting what the narrative was doing at the time. The team also started working with the writer of the Half-Life series, Mark Laidlaw, as they found a way to fit Portal into Half-Life's world. This sort of makes sense, given that many of the assets from Half-Life were already being reused, so hey, fuck it, just smash the two worlds together. Actually, speaking about assets, another thing that I really want to touch base with is the design decision behind Portal's art style. So initially, Portal's test chambers had a lot more decorative elements, but players were often getting distracted, leading to the sleek white design we're familiar with today. And there are plenty of specific sections of the game that are pretty well covered with developer interviews. Stuff like GLaDOS's boss fight, the companion cube test chamber, Shell's player model, the Rat Man, the usage of cake in the plot. There's a ton of stuff here. Basically anything you can think of that relates to Portal has been covered in some capacity by some developer interview or the commentary for the game. For the sake of brevity, I won't go into too much detail about all of these development facts, but hey, if you're interested in learning more, I left a link in the description of this video for you guys to check out. The decision to release Portal as part of the Orange Box collection alongside Half-Life 2 and Team Fortress 2 was primarily done for those two to act as almost a safety net for Portal. Understandable, the game was very different from both of those two, with an emphasis on puzzle solving rather than straight up action. If I had to take a guess, this is also probably a large factor in having Portal be such a short length. Portal initially launched as part of the Orange Box collection in October of 2007 to Xbox 360 and PC, and then in November for PS3. And to say that Valve might have been a little unnecessarily worried would be a bit of an understatement. Portal got scores in the low 90s across all platforms. PC Gamer UK gave the game a score of 92 and said, "Portal is a magnificent puzzle game. The titillating wrongness of every solution and the wonky thinking required to get there make you feel like a space-folding genius, and yet you'll almost never get stuck." While GameSpot gave the game a 90 and said, "With delightfully unique gameplay and fantastically witty writing, Portal is a huge success." Portal was, honestly, a bit of a weird one to track down when it came to sales numbers. There were some ports between the release of Portals 1 and 2 that the release of the first game sold around 4 million units across all available consoles between the Orange Box Collection and the standard release. Afterwards, those numbers are a bit more hard to find. According to VG Insights, Portal has sold over 24 million copies on Steam alone, which, I mean, come on, who uses Steam and doesn't have a copy of Portal at this point? The game goes on sale for less than $1, and it's amongst the highest rated games on the platform. When you factor in the previous Orange Box and the Portal Companion Collection for the Switch, you can imagine that number would be even higher than that. The accolades for this game are numerous and plentiful, with Portal being nominated for and winning several awards for Best PC, Xbox 360, Puzzle, Most Innovative Design, Best Writing, and Overall Game of the Year. Not to mention the numerous nods that publication gave Portal for the soundtrack, particularly Still Alive, their villain with GLaDOS, and the multiple placements on lists of greatest games of all time. It should be pretty obvious now that the success of Portal far surpassed anything that Valve ever anticipated. The game would go on to have a huge modding scene, plenty of fan-made and official merchandise, and a full-fledged sequel a few years later. But what do I think of the game now that it's 2024 and we're a decade and a half past its initial release? Well, hey, my opinion reflects what I put in the thumbnail of this video, look at that. I think that if you only have an hour or two to play video games, and you want a single-player game that you can easily breeze through, Portal is your absolute best option. This is for a myriad of things, from the puzzle-solving elements that have you view the level design in a completely different way, to the sleek art style and aesthetic, to the thought-provoking environmental storytelling, to the masterful writing and characterization of GLaDOS, to the absolutely brilliant pacing of this game's test chambers and story, to hell, how it's 100% feasible for anyone who has never played a video game before to sit down and beat this in one sitting. Everything here is
perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Well, maybe not everything. For as revolutionary a game as Portal is, there is one thing that runs true throughout the game, and that is its lack of realization in its potential. Everything I just listed is so close to being the absolute apex of what gaming has to offer, but the game's shorter runtime and the original lack of scope really do hold this game back from being in that upper echelon. Thankfully, this is something that Valve would rectify a few years later in the sequel. Spoilers for that next review. Regardless of that, what we have on display in the first entry to this series is still a wondrous work that I think anyone can truly enjoy. We've got a lot to discuss today, so without further ado, this is my review of Portal. One of the first things I think about when I hear of Portal is the absolutely stellar art design behind the game. Now, this isn't a game that's going to wow you with a vast color palette or some really out there world designs, but instead takes the neutral tones in the familiar office and factory style setting and turns them into an engaging world that both serves as a way to guide the player but also entice them. One of the very first things that Portal establishes are what surfaces you are able to place a portal on, with the white and beige surfaces being your primary target, while the stone-like grays and the rustic browns being untargetable. This creates a set of rules for the player and allows them to have an anchor for even some of the more slightly obtuse puzzles later on, when traversal isn't always as straightforward as it might seem. This is further complemented with the orange and blue portals that the player is able to place. We might mostly associate this color pairing with either a Star Wars or a Marvel-styled movie poster nowadays, since it is one of the most striking color combinations, and Portal understands that philosophy and applies it to its neutral backdrop to great effect. There's also an incredibly interesting dichotomy that is going on when we talk about the comparison between the mostly sleek test chambers and the back rooms of the factory and office areas. The game starts with the player making their way through these pure white test chambers that are almost a precursor to the minimalist aesthetic design philosophy that many people associate with modern Star Trek movies or even Apple products to a greater extent. Portal was an early practitioner in that style, at least in the gaming space, and almost created a slightly exaggerated mirrored version of where society was progressing at a technological rate at the time, at least when it came to its visuals.
Everything is chrome in the future!
In this case, replace the chrome with white and you're spot on. This can further be seen with some of the interactables, such as the radio, turrets, and cubes that wouldn't look out of place if you saw them sitting on a shelf at a retailer like Best Buy or something. All except for GLaDOS, as her design combines both the sleek science fiction stylings that we've seen throughout the game with the addition of an almost humanoid feminine framework to create something that really makes her into something wholly unique. Now, as you progress through the game, you will see little glimpses of what Aperture Labs looks like when you peel back the curtain. You see tubes running through the facility delivering items to various chambers, you see the rust-filled backrooms behind the scenes that one would expect in a giant warehouse-like facility, and most concerning, you see the barren viewing decks and office areas, which I will go into a little bit more detail when it comes to the game's environmental storytelling. But from a pure artistic standpoint, just know that it provides an excellent counter to what the player was initially presented. This all culminates with the final battle with GLaDOS, where you cross a giant bridge into this massive cube-like structure. Up until that point, the biggest sci-fi marvel that we had to look at that way was some of the test chambers that had light bridges or moving stairs. In the game's climactic final showdown, it looks like something that is straight up from the movie Cube, and it punctuates the game's setting perfectly. Performance is essentially flawless, assuming you were playing the standard version of the game and not the RTX version that Valve put out more recently with their partnership with Nvidia. The standard game looks great to this day because the art style is brilliant, but of course with the advent of ray tracing technology, it could always look a little better. And that version of the game does. Particle effects around portals are spectacular, the reflections on glass are also magnificent. That version also runs like complete shit. Look, I had a number of crashes, couldn't get the game to run at a consistent frame rate. It's bad. I'm running this on an RTX 4092 with a Ryzen 9 5900X and 48GB of RAM. It's not your fault. I really shouldn't be having any issue, but from what I'm seeing online, this is sadly the norm for that version of the game. Stick to the standard version. You could try the RTX one if you'd like, since it's free anyways. Don't expect your story to be any different though. Getting back on track, the sound design for Portal is also something I think doesn't truly get enough credit. Starting with the OST, I believe that while it's a little bit more on the short side given the game's scope, it does an excellent job of being immersive and enhancing the player's experience while also not being too distracting. It's a very similar idea to what I said in my Minecraft video, link up top, but there are often times that you'll be doing something a little bit more mundane, like simply moving a cube, walking down a hallway, or flying through the air traversing a puzzle, but the way the game's synth-riddled soundtrack ramps up during those moments makes you feel like you're doing something really important. These ambient tracks add a level of progressive electronics to these dark and spacey styles of composition that make the slower moments into something to remember. And when the adrenaline starts picking up with having turrets and rocket launchers trying to gun you down, the electro-industrial tracks begin kicking in, giving the game songs that could fit perfectly in with the Matrix soundtrack. I think the main reason the OST gets so overlooked is because of the song that the game ends on, Still Alive. A very melancholic song that is actually sung by Ellen McLean, who both voices GLaDOS and was actually a classically trained soprano. How's that for a combination? This song is what most people think of when you talk about the music of this game, and understandably so. It was even in a rock band, for God's sakes. And it's a good song, don't get me wrong. I just think the rest of the soundtrack deserves a little bit more love, personally. The audio design in general is a total earworm. From the many sounds that were taken straight from Half-Life for those that have observant ears, to the iconic sounds of shooting a portal, entering and exiting a portal, it's all so memorable. Then there's the voice acting, and for the most part, it's all Ellen McLean. GLaDOS is technically the only real character in this game, with pretty much everything else that is voiced being an extension of her in some sort of way. The delivery is perfect. GLaDOS gives the same cold delivery for the first two acts of the game that, when in combination with the game's brilliant writing, makes the difference between something expositive, humorous, or sinister. When the game reaches its final act and you start to hear a new range of angry and desperate emotions from GLaDOS, it elevates the game's stakes to an even greater height. The delivery Ellen McLean gives for the extensions of GLaDOS are very fun in and of themselves. You have the childlike wonder of the turrets and the curiosity core, the rambling of the intelligence core, and the demonic growls of the anger sphere. It sounds like a Korn song. It actually surprises me that they didn't get Jonathan Davis himself to do that. Holy shit, I had no idea that was Mike Patton from Faith No More. That's fucking awesome. Well, since we're getting into voice acting and talking about the characters and shit, I already spoiled the ending of the game about 3 times now, how about we talk about the story real quick? Let's start with the plot. So we wake up in a test chamber from a stasis bed and are immediately given instructions from an AI named GLaDOS about some upcoming tests that she would like us to perform. We find out that we're in a place called Aperture Laboratories, and when I was younger, I thought that this logo right here was a C and this group was kidnapping its test subjects. Little did I know that I was spelling capture incorrectly, and long story short, I don't have a degree and now I'm making YouTube videos. Hey. Oh, sorry, back to the story. Upon GLaDOS creating a portal for us, we see that we're taking control of a woman named Shell. Now, Shell doesn't really speak or have much of a backstory that is apparent to the player at all, but instead is more of a conduit or maybe a shell for the player to see the world through. Oh, I see what you did in your game, Newell. Get over here, you little rascal. I think of Shell as a Gordon Freeman with less characterization since the primary focus is on GLaDOS. And I think that works fine, and if anything, makes what GLaDOS saying feel even more personal since it seems like she's directing it towards the player rather than Shell herself. So we make our way through a few test chambers and are slowly introduced to the new portal gun, a device that can essentially create a rift in space between 2 points and connect them together seamlessly. We continue through multiple test chambers, and GLaDOS gives us the sole thing that any video game protagonist would be happy to be rewarded with: cake. Well, sign me the fuck up, we're going to be running some experiments, solving some puzzles, using a fun sci-fi gadget, and we get cake? Sounds like a good deal to me. As we progress through the chambers, there are a number of events that occur that make us start to see that something isn't quite right with what's going on here. GLaDOS seems to be alluding to other test subjects in the past safety being disregarded in a slightly comical but mostly very cruel way, and some of the test chambers are being filled with military-grade turrets and hazardous liquids. I think the big emotional turning points really start to come from 2 events. The first being the Ratman alcoves that we see in a few of the test chambers. Occasionally you'll find a section of one of the test chambers that isn't operational and leads into the back rooms area I spoke of earlier. This is where you find notes written on the wall from an entity only known as the Ratman. This looks like it may have been messages left by a former test subject and says things like asking for help, she's watching you, and the cake is a lie. This is where the environmental storytelling really starts to come into play, and let me just say it's a masterclass that we'll touch on a little bit more later. And the other sign that something sinister is in the works is Test Chamber 17, the one with the companion cube. A seemingly normal chamber that has you take a cube from the beginning to the end to solve a number of puzzles. But bam, throw a heart on that box and suddenly you care about the cube like it's your own child. This is all until the end where GLaDOS has you incinerate the cube, pretty much the only thing that has given you any sort of comfort in this game so far, in order to progress. This chamber is amazing, if for anything, just to see people's reactions near the end. Some people, such as myself when first playing, were pretty adamant on defying GLaDOS and trying to find a way to keep the cube alive. I mean, it was so helpful, and again, look at the cute heart. Need I say more? Other people, and I'm using people here loosely, chucked the cube into the furnace and went on their day not thinking about anything else. These people should be locked up. But in all seriousness, I think this is a very interesting character study that I think games like the Stanley Parable may have taken some inspiration from and explored that idea a little bit further. Regardless, in order to progress, you do have to destroy the companion cube in order to move on. Gone but not forgotten. Gone but not forgotten. We continue making our way through increasingly difficult and deadly chambers until we reach the end where we are shuttled into a room where we can claim our cake. We round the corner and... is the cake behind all of that fire? Well, as it turns out, the cake was a lie this whole time. What a meme that was in 2007 and 2008, let me tell you. So with quick thinking, we were able to avoid the death trap, which GLaDOS then panics and tries to cover up her attempted murder. We make our way through the maintenance area of the facility as GLaDOS becomes even more and more manic. She tries to deceive us, bargain with us, manipulate us, reason with us, before she finally snaps and admits to her initial plans of killing us, and she wants to see it through to the end. This is where we see more of the environmental storytelling on display, as all the office areas have been vacated for some time, leading us to believe that we are alone in here with GLaDOS, and the only way to take care of her is to confront her directly. And wouldn't you know it, we do just that, meeting her in a large chamber for our final confrontation. This boss battle in a narrative sense is spectacular. First, a core falls from her body, and you see the same incinerator that she made you use to destroy the companion cube earlier in the game, over in the corner. Instantly, a light bulb goes off in your head, and you know what you need to do, and that's avenge the one thing you had during this journey in the most poetic way possible. Upon dropping in that first core though, it is revealed that was GLaDOS' morality core, a core that was installed after she filled the facility with a neurotoxin gas that killed all of its employees, and you just gave her control over that again. Not only does destroying this core begin a timer that will cause that same fate to befall you, but you also took out one of the last human things about GLaDOS, and she immediately shifts gears into this sinister, no-nonsense delivery to give a shivering performance as the final boss fight continues. After dumping her remaining cores, the facility begins to be torn asunder, launching both Shell and GLaDOS to the outside world. The final thing you see from Shell's perspective is her laying in the parking lot surrounded by the pieces of debris from GLaDOS before being dragged away by an unforeseen robotic entity. The game ends with a chorus of personality cores, a cake with a single lit candle, and your best friend in the companion cube in a room before a robot hand extinguishes the candle, putting an end to Portal's story. Just wow. What is there to say about everything we just witnessed? I've seen games take 10 times as long. Hell, I've seen games take nearly 50 times as long to tell their stories, and they still didn't have as many highs as Portal has in its 1 to 2 hour runtime. Portal is a game that wastes no time. No test chamber is without purpose, no line of dialogue is said without intention, there isn't a single break in this game, and I love it for that. The environmental storytelling, S tier. What else can you say? There's so many hidden bits of world building, such as the competition between Aperture and Black Mesa from Half-Life, that offer such interesting world implications that you don't get out of 99% of video games. The visuals complement the story that is being directly presented to the player perfectly, while the sleek white test chambers look inviting and give the player a feeling of both something that's safe and sterile. The maintenance areas behind the chambers are ugly, rustic, and are filled with dark secrets exactly like the game's narrative itself, and they play on the themes of obedience, trust, and how far we should actually allow technology, especially AI, to progress. Oh, I'm watching you. The pacing is marvelous. You never walk into a test chamber and wonder what pissed off GLaDOS all of a sudden. Everything is gradual, and you really only start to notice that buildup when you are looking back at the previous interactions retroactively. There are points where the story does ramp up, but it's all foreshadowed perfectly, and it never feels jarring in any sense. Every conclusion that GLaDOS comes to, you can see why she got there. GLaDOS has long been considered as not only one of gaming's best villains, but also one of its best characters. Normally in a video game, we complain that these characters aren't human enough, that they do stupid things, or they have quip-filled dialogue like they're in a fucking Marvel movie. GLaDOS, in the span of 1 hour, showed more humanity than any character in Starfield did, and that game is well over 50 hours in length. The emotions that GLaDOS has on display, especially during the second half of the game, are incredibly realistic as she tries everything in her power to get the player to cooperate. And then during the final battle, it becomes something straight out of 2001: A Space Odyssey as she goes full Hal and tries to kill your ass. The writing punctuates this so well. GLaDOS' first role is to guide the player, introduce them to the gameplay and world concepts, but then starts to add this macabre humor as the game gives anecdotes and warnings about previous tests. When she tries to kill the player, it's just business as usual, and when we defy her, she doesn't know how to react and does what most humans would do in that situation and tries to turn things around to the best of her ability. And again, when you take out her personality core, I don't think that there has ever been a more intimidating villain in a video game. The story is near perfection, and it's one game that I like to point to when it comes to showing how video games can tell stories in a way that other art forms can't. And you know what the crazy thing is? I've spent all this time just talking about the audio, the visuals, and the game's story. I haven't even gotten to the gameplay yet. Rest assured though, there's a whole lot to love here too. In Portal, we take control of Shell in a first-person perspective as we navigate the test chambers to solve puzzles and platforming challenges. Some of the more dangerous of these platforming challenges include turrets, hazardous liquids, and crushers. Thankfully, gravity isn't an issue since Shell is equipped with these reinforced heel springs, so fall damage is never a worry. Shell on her own can't really do too much. She can pick up and lightly throw objects and jump, and that's about it. No, the real star of the show with Shell's abilities comes when she gets the portal gun. The portal gun is where you're going to find the primary focus with this game's mechanics. The gun essentially fires a blue and an orange portal to a light surface that creates a seamless passageway between two different points. You cannot shoot portals through already placed down portals, and when you shoot a portal that has the same color as one that you already placed to a new location, that old portal will go away. Outside of those couple of limitations, you are able to use the portal gun freely, and it is an absolutely incredible feature. The technology behind this is still incredibly impressive to this day. You just place down 2 portals and can walk through with no issue, and this all happens instantaneously. You can do a ton of different useful things with this, such as moving you to areas you couldn't get through before and redirecting energy balls to power switches, or you could do some less useful things, such as create an infinite falling loop or look at yourself through the portals. Jokes aside, the infinite falling loop is a great segue into the game's next big feature, the physics system. Really popularized by Half-Life 2 a few years prior, Portal continues the trend of having physics-based first-person platforming and puzzle solving. The physics work much like how they would in real life. If you place a box too close to the edge, it's gonna fall over. If you redirect an energy ball to bounce off of a surface, it will go where it should. If you fall through one of your portals at an elevated surface, your momentum will carry through as you exit. The combination between Shell's abilities, the portal gun, and the physics engine are how you, the player, are going to solve many of this game's puzzles. Now, the puzzles are something that are baked into the level design, so you kinda can't really talk about one without the other, so let's put all the pieces together real quick. Each test chamber, GLaDOS will give you a semblance of instruction for your next task, or a hint of what there is to come. Every chamber has surfaces that are easily distinguishable for what you are and aren't able to put a portal on, and your goal is to make it through the end of that test. As the player goes on, there will be instances that will test the player's abilities on timing, understand the portal gun's mechanics, and their usage of physics. The chambers will do things such as require the player to redirect an energy ball into an area while also making sure that they have timed the door to open with a button press. They will be required to move cubes between rooms to keep switches open to go further into the chamber, and they will be tasked with finding clever ways out of enemy lines of sight with their usage of portals and objects. The script gets flipped in the second half of the game when the player is in the maintenance areas because while the puzzles still exist, they're a little bit more integrated into the environment in a natural way. This is where the game for the most part stops introducing new concepts and instead tests the players on what they've already learned. This works in both a narrative and gameplay sense, since the final stretch of the game you will be making your way through the facility to encounter the game's sole boss, GLaDOS herself. Now this boss fight, from a mechanical level, isn't the craziest thing in the world. It's mainly a test of everything that you've learned throughout your journey, but it isn't the most interactable boss fight you've ever seen. I think it's fine enough though, because all of the heavy lifting being done with the presentation and narrative elements, which elevates what would be an encounter that I would say is mechanically passable into something truly iconic. So the puzzles themselves throughout Portal aren't necessarily the most complex things in the world either. As you go through the game, they will ask more and more of the player, but because of the excellent way the game teaches you its systems, you never really feel blindsided by a spike in difficulty. I had to give Valve some of the highest praise for being developers that introduce a mechanic, slowly iterate on that mechanic as the game progresses until taking that mechanic to its logical conclusion and highest possibility. I think very few developers understand how to teach the player how their games operate better than Valve, with maybe only Nintendo and From Software being their peers, and Portal is a phenomenal example of that. Well, let's say you do want a bit more of a challenge with Portal. Thankfully, you do have some optional content that will put players to the test with the challenge mode and advanced chambers. Now, the challenge mode will task players with completing the chambers from the base game with the goal of having either the shortest time, the fewest amount of portals shot, or taking the least amount of footsteps as possible. I think these are good and can definitely be something to challenge yourself to improve at in the game. Maybe even start to get into that speedrunner mindset, who knows. The advanced chambers are something a little bit different though. These are remixed versions of a number of test chambers of the main game, and man, if you breezed through Portal and thought to yourself that this game was too easy, have these got something in store for you. These are much more difficult than the story chambers, asking the player to place portals under the most strict time frames, being able to shoot them to launch yourself to a new area within just a few frames, and having to contend with turrets that cannot be destroyed, or replacing the companion cube with a sphere.
It's spherical! Spherical!
Definitely a step up in difficulty. I just wish that maybe there were a few more exclusive chambers that were completely new in this mode. But hey, that's a very minor complaint, and when everything else of the gameplay is essentially flawless, that's not a bad problem to have. Typically when I do these reviews, you can usually tell when I have a favorite aspect of the game. Whether it's the presentation, the story, or the gameplay, there always seems to be one thing that shines through, but with Portal, it's a little bit of a different case. I legitimately have a hard time deciding what my favorite part about this game is. I think the art style, OST, and the voice performances are all absolutely stellar, and the narrative is incredibly deep and engaging, and the gameplay challenges the player to think of their environment in a completely different way and is an excellent source of teaching the player how to think outside the box. Again, no pun intended. What can I say other than I just wish there was a little bit more? Yeah, we have an entire sequel to look forward to, and trust me, if you think I've been gushing about this game, wait until we talk about Portal 2. But when looking at Portal 1 in a vacuum, I just can't help but wish there was a little bit more here. For what it is, I legitimately don't think that they could have done any better given the scope of the game initially started out as. Valve made the absolute most of what they had with Portal, and I respect the game for that. But if the game was just a little bit longer, or maybe it had a little bit more optional content, I would absolutely put this as one of my favorite games of all time. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. The game is perfect for what it is. I just liked it so much that I wanted to see more, you know? Like in the time that it took you to watch this video, you possibly could have started and beaten the game by now. Don't you feel like you wasted your time? But man, even while the game is short, it's still chock full of worthwhile content that I think anyone can enjoy. This game is just a total breeze to get through. It never overstays its welcome. I don't know what else to say other than just play it. If you somehow don't have this game, what are you doing? It's $10 on Steam and regularly goes on sale for 90% off. Get on that shit. Seriously, play it if you haven't already, or play it again if it's been a minute. But that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of Portal? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving it a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.